Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we start the next panel, I have the great pleasure of inviting Hilda Schwab to come to the podium to deliver a very special message from a very special person.
During the preparation for the annual meeting 2011, we reached out to inspirational leaders from around the world. There was one person in particular who we wished could share her vision with all of us here in Davos. We knew there was a very low chance of this happening, given her current situation. But just today, we received a very special message from a very special person that we would like to share with you as we are gathered here in the plenary hall. That person is Aung San Suu Kyi from Myanmar. In the spirit of Davos, we present to you her audio message. Please.
Distinguished guests, heads of state, government and UN officials, leaders of global companies, representatives of the media, academia, NGOs and young global leaders. I'm very honored and privileged to have this opportunity to address the World Economic Forum in Davos. I would especially like to extend my appreciation to Professor Klaus Schwab and the organizers of this influential gathering of leaders who are committed to improving the state of this planet. Over the past few years, despite my isolation from much of the world, I have been able to follow closely the global response to the economic downturn through listening assiduously to radio broadcasts. While the challenges were immense, the response was both swift and strong. Of course, much still remains to be done. Our global interdependence has compelled and resulted in increased cooperation. In this context, however, I would like to speak on behalf of the 55 million people of Burma who have, for the most part, been left behind. We yearn to be a part of the global community, not only to be economically and socially connected, but also to achieve the domestic political stability and national reconciliation that would enable us to fully address the needs of our people. Economic policies linked to human development and capacity building are the best path to the achievement of stability in a democratic transition. We have already missed so many opportunities because of political conflicts in our country over the last 50 years. Despite an abundance of natural resources, Burma's development has lagged far behind its neighbors. Our government annually spends about 40% of our GDP on the military and barely 2% on health and education combined. The young people of Burma need the kind of education that has enabled young global leaders, some of whom are present at this gathering, to excel so early in their careers. We need investments in technology and infrastructure. We need to counter and eventually eradicate widespread poverty by offering opportunities that will allow the entrepreneurial spirit of our people to be gainfully harnessed through micro-lending programs. The National League for Democracy has, in fact, embarked on an experimental microcredit scheme on a very small scale. We need to address the tragic consequences of preventable diseases, particularly in conflict zones and rural areas. At the same time, we also need to pay close attention to the costs and collateral damage of our development, whether environmental or social. These, however, can be contained if we plan ahead responsibly. In addition to these enormous challenges, we also need to reform our legal system that we might be able to attract foreign direct investment and guarantee the rule of law. I believe that as necessary steps towards integration within the global community, Burma must achieve national reconciliation, political stability, and economic growth grounded in human resources development. Without the first two, which are essential for the basic requirements of good governance, such as transparency, accountability, credibility, and integrity, social and economic development will remain mere pipe dreams. I would like to request those who have invested or are thinking of investing in Burma to put a premium on respect for the law, on environmental and social factors, on the rights of workers, on job creation, and on the promotion of technological skills. Such an approach would not only be in line with a global sense of responsibility, it would lead in the long run to greater benefits for all concerned. I look forward to the day when there will be a political and social environment that is favorable to a wide range of investments in Burma. We are certainly in need of innovation and diversification if our country is to fulfill the aspirations of its people and catch up with the rest of the world. I would like to appeal to all those present at this gathering to use their particular opportunities and skills as far as possible to promote national reconciliation, genuine democratization, human development, and economic growth in Burma, that our people may in turn be able to make their own contribution towards a safer, happier world. Thank you.
That was a very vivid reminder of why we're all here, which isn't an economic rationale, it's to improve the state of the world. My name is Robert Greenhill, Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce an exceptional panel to talk about a critical issue, the future of enterprise. Because if we look back over the last 3 years, it's been a challenging time for us all. It's been a challenging time in terms of realities and also in terms of reputations. Today, corporations' balance sheets are strong, but actually societies are still in a very difficult situation. Governments' balance sheets are weak, personal balance sheets are weak, and actually the reputational balance sheets of corporations are still in a deficit situation. And yet, what's the alternative to the enterprise? The idea of state intervention of a couple of years ago is now disappearing quickly. GM has now become a majority owned by the private sector. Governments are having to cut their engagement in many areas of social programs, not just to mention economic programs. And while corporations are criticized, they're absolutely essential. In fact, the inspirational message we just heard included within it a plea for investment and engagement, but in the right way, in the way that would actually improve societies. This is the challenge, and this is also the great collective opportunity we have to discuss here today. And I'm delighted to be able to do this with an exceptional panel. And what I would like to do is to start with Indra Nooyi, the CEO of Pepsi. Talk about the future of enterprise. When you took on this role, you were thinking very much about that. Perhaps share your thinking and how that's evolved.
Thank you, Robert. And I think this is a topic that needs to be debated and talked about. And I want to go back a little bit to my own origins. You know, I was born and brought up in India, spent a lot of bulk of my early childhood there. And I watched multinational companies in India. They were both a force for good and a force for not so good in the country. There were multinationals that brought in life-saving drugs, did a lot of good things for the country, but they also polluted streams and waters and did not so good things. I never then dreamed I would ever be leading a multinational company. But in 2006, when I took on the role of the CEO of PepsiCo, I decided that I wanted PepsiCo to always be a force for good in every society in which we operated. So the first year that I was CEO, we articulated a direction for the company called Performance with Purpose. And Performance with Purpose meant that we wanted to weave purpose into every aspect of our performance, not in the sense of corporate social responsibility. It was purpose defined such that you could not deliver performance unless you executed on purpose. So let me give you an example. The first aspect of purpose was change the product portfolio. Shift it so that there's a good balance of products from fun for you to better for you to good for you. Because we had a product portfolio that was skewed to more fun for you products. Lifestyles and societies had changed, so we had to shift our portfolio. On the environmental side, we committed to shifting the portfolio so that we saved water, we saved energy, we did all of our products in biodegradable packaging, commit to environmental sustainability goals. And the third part of purpose was make sure that our employees were treated very well. Make sure our talent is sustained so that the company can deliver great performance year over year. So performance with purpose was born. Now, interestingly, in my heart, I knew that performance with purpose was the only way that I could run the company. And I started to sell it inside the company. But a lot of skeptics questioned why PepsiCo should follow performance with purpose. In fact, we even had some investors ask the question whether performance with purpose was, in fact, diluting shareholder value. And, it made me pause and think whether I was doing the wrong thing for the company, even though if that was not the way we were going to run the company, I couldn't be CEO because I didn't know any other model with which to run the company. So I turned to our general counsel and said, Larry, I'd like you to go back and write me a legal document on what is a responsible corporation. What is the definition of a responsible corporation? Give me a legal definition. And if I'm violating the law by articulating performance with purpose, let's talk about it. So Larry wrote a brilliant document on the responsible corporation, going back to the original laws of the joint stock company, which basically said the joint stock company operates under the laws of limited liability. And the reason companies operate under laws of limited liability from society is because you owe that society a duty of care. What we forgot is that we owe that society, every society in which we operate in, a duty of care. So we focused on short-term profits and we forgot the duty of care. Now, in articulating performance with purpose, we were not saying that we should forget short-term profits and focus on the long term. We believe that short-term profits and long-term sustainability are not mutually exclusive, because long-term thinking ensures the sustainability of a business but gives you a license to operate in the society in the short term. Long-term thinking generates short-term value, and long-term thinking resonates with the consumer today. So I would just make a plea, Robert, for all of us as CEOs and professors and activists, we need to go back to the future. The future of the company is a good one, but the key lies in the past. Let's go back to the origins of the joint stock company and take very seriously this duty of care to every society we have to operate in. And if we revive the feeling that we owe every society a duty of care, if we look out ahead beyond the quarterly earnings cycle, I think the future for corporations will be bright. If we don't do that, I think corporations are constantly going to be questioned. And I go back to a great statement by a satirist, a guy called Ambrose Bierce, and he said, a corporation is an ingenious device for obtaining individual profit without individual responsibility. I don't want us to be painted that way. I think the time has come for us to take this word, duty of care, very, very seriously.
Thank you, Indra. Michael Porter, you've been looking at issues of competitiveness, value creation, strategy for a number of years with great effect around the world. You've tended to focus on issues that you felt passionately about. You came out recently with what I'm sure will become a seminal article challenging some of these issues of short-term value creation and actually the idea that it somehow separated corporate well-being from social well-being. Could you share with us your thoughts on that? But first of all, why did you decide to focus on this right now?
Well, Robert, I feel like we in business are in a very, very difficult place right now, in a very challenging place, in sort of a watershed moment. I think that business is widely perceived as profiting at the expense of the communities in which it's operating. And there's been a real erosion of trust and legitimacy in business. And I can feel it and touch it in many different ways. And I think most of us here, I'm sure, have felt many of these same issues. I think there's a sense in which the corporation has been seen as sort of violating its fundamental purpose. And I think that this is not only a challenge for business from the outside, but it's also a challenge from within the corporations. I think young people and even not so young people working in corporations, I think are looking for a sense of purpose that is more than our job is to maximize and pile up the maximum profits we can in the short term, full stop. And so I became convinced that we had backed ourselves into a very narrow view of what capitalism was all about. We'd backed ourselves into a very narrow view of how to create economic value. A value creation model that was extremely short-term, that really ignored a lot of the most important needs, that ignored a lot of the things in the community and in the society that was really affecting the ultimate profitability of the corporation. And so out of that sense of concern came this article, which I call Creating Shared Value. And the basic idea is that there's, in many ways, the company can better create economic value by actually addressing many of the most important societal issues around it, such as the environment, such as health, such as safety, such as the well-being of their employees. And the question was, how could we kind of rethink the role of the corporation and really the boundaries of the capitalist model itself?
And when you're looking at the situation today, or that challenge today, is it simply going back to where we were before? Are there elements that are new, that are distinctive today?
Well, I think it's a combination of going back, and it's a combination of just learning from a lot of work that's been done over the last several decades. I mean, if we go back quite some years, corporations used to accept a lot more responsibility for the community. And there are many famous examples of that going back in history. Companies kind of understood that it was their job to make sure that their employees' circumstances were favorable. It was their job to address some of these issues in their communities, because they understood that if that community wasn't healthy, the company wouldn't be healthy, and it couldn't prosper. Over time, I think, for a variety of reasons, companies have sort of started to see those ideas as outside of their scope. And indeed, there's a huge movement in business that the job of a corporation is to make a profit, and anything else, any other use of resources, is illegitimate. I mean, this is the Milton Friedman argument, that social responsibility or philanthropy or any other activity besides kind of narrow maximization of profit is illegitimate. It's taking other people's money. And we backed ourselves into that very narrow view. But at the same time, as we started dealing with issues like the environment, we started discovering that actually water usage is actually not just good environmental practice. Worrying about water use is pretty darn important for running the company productively, and not wasting packaging, and not using more energy, and not shipping goods and services around the world in some supply chain without thinking about the true cost of that from the company's point of view. So I think there's a combination of sort of the evolution of thinking in business narrowing, but also some new learning about how to actually operate a company efficiently. I mean, I have the concept I developed called the value chain, and I think we're learning how that the way we thought we were being smart in operating our value chains actually wasn't so smart. That if we understood the full cost of logistics and the full cost of the resource use, we actually weren't being so smart. So I think it's that combination of going back and going forward. But I tell you, there's a tremendous momentum behind this kind of narrow Milton Friedman-like view of what capitalism is all about, and it's just like exhilarating to listen to Indra talk about her philosophy, because I think she's exactly moving in the right direction.
Paul, Paul Bulcke, as CEO of Nestlé, you're leading an organization that's got a great history, but is also constantly changing as well. What's your reaction to what Michael's just been saying, and actually, how realistic is it to try to actually do that?
First of all, this question of the future of the enterprise is touching the fundamental thing in our society. I would call it, you said, forward to basics, basically. That is, what does the economical activity do in society, per se? And actually, we should get back to a better understanding of how the basic mechanisms and also the basic workings of enterprise, of companies or entrepreneurship, together combined with competition that is driving an innovation and gives dynamics, how that is fundamentally linked with prosperity and creating prosperity in society at large. I'm a fundamental believer that when you combine, first of all, a long-term vision of things, and I think the common denominator of all what we're talking here is having a long-term vision on what the company should do. You have to be long-term inspired. You have to act today. You have to combine that. It should not be contradictory, though. And when you do that in a very strong set of values, your economical activity should also and will create value for society at large. So it is our fundamental belief that a company can only be successful over time. In other words, creating shareholder value, as you do say it or define it narrowly, can only be successful over time when it connects in everything it does positively with society at large. And actually that's a fundamental hypothesis that you can test. If you then split your value chain, upstream, downstream, inside your walls, and you see in everything you do what's in for me, for the company, success, what's in for society, and you see how that interacts. And actually you can measure these things to a certain extent. You see how actually linking up with society is not something that comes after 7 in the afternoon. It should be intrinsically linked with your basic activity. And so in that example, or in that line, we have defined in Nestlé and said, what is our activity and how can we, in a more meaningful way, interact with society in a positive, creating value way. And we have seen nutrition as definitely one of these areas where we are, that's the purpose of our company, how we can, through our food and beverages, bring nutritional arguments, and how we can drive research and development into that, how we can use products as carriers of micronutrients. And we do that over 1 billion products a day, can be carriers for nutrients. And how that interacts positively also with our business purpose at large. How we then also, the second part, nutrition first, the second part was water. And how through our activity we are so intimately linked with water. Raw material is agriculture is water. How we need water in our processes. Water is definitely something that we can also meaningfully be part of global discussions, putting the right agendas, but also act upon. And the third one is rural development. Again, we have so many factories in the world, 470 factories in the world spread, and they normally are in the rural areas. How can we then again radiate with so many farmers we're working directly and with agronomes working and creating better yields for them, better sustainable incomes, etc. So it should be how companies link up with society should be linked with their specific activity per se, and it should be in everything it does. Actually, term, and we have worked and also with Michael on this term of creating shared value, stands in contrast to sharing created value. We are not talking about philanthropy here. We're not talking about doing whatever you have to do, short-term profit, and then at the end of the year you write a nice check and you go to heaven, which is actually sharing created value, and then whether and how you get there. It is basically the contrast. It is creating shared value in everything you do, which is so fundamental. And this is not new. This was the fundamental role of I call it the homo economicus, the entrepreneur, creating something positively in society at large.
And how do you deal with the tough trade-offs in doing this? I mean, in the industry, either for Indra or Paul, you have this combination of different products. You know, it would be easy to actually sell products that might be attractive to the consumer but not so good for them. How do you actually deal with this? When you talk about nutrition, micronutrients that's one way to do it, but how do you deal with this question of balance?
You have to put things in perspective again. Long term is something that is more important in this whole equation than we think. And for example, nutrition. If we see how nutrition is important for the productivity of a country, of the economical development of a country, well, why would you not bring micronutrients into your products? Actually, you give additional arguments for your products. But you create also a better environment and healthier economy.
So you're engaging the consumer in this whole conversation.
It is this balancing act of long-term inspiration and contextual thinking, and yet acting short-term too. So I don't see any conflict of long-term contextual thinking of a company and yet acting short-term. So it looks like there are certain conflicts that you say, well, we can have a smart run here and profit from. But we have been around for close to 150 years now, and actually we started off by bringing a nutritional product to the market, and we have done that ever since. So I don't see a conflict here. And there's our act also, because you may now come on and say the financial world wants the results tomorrow. How do you combine that with that long-term vision and all? Well, I think it's a little bit of our role as CEOs and to lead that and to argument on these issues too. And to stand our point and saying, no, we're not going to compromise long-term vision in a framework of strong values for short-term gains. And actually that is what happened over the last years. When short-termism takes over, then you get against the wall, and that's something we have learned the hard way.
Heard of a couple of examples from the consumer products category. Tiam, you've been involved in looking at issues from the private sector point of view, public service. You've advised prime ministers, presidents, the secretary general, as now the group CEO of Prudential. How do you try to deal with these challenges from an issue of the financial services industry, particularly the insurance industry?
Yes, Robert, I think I will echo a number of things that have already been said here. For me, the key issue in all this is the time horizon on which you're projecting yourself and managing your company. Prudential is 163 years old, so it's a bit like Nestlé with 150 years, and you don't get to be that old unless you've managed things in the short term very well and also in the long term. And we are very lucky to the extent that we are in a long-term business by nature. I define it as the business of promises. When I tell a customer in the UK or Indonesia that we will pay them a pension in 2036, they have to believe that. They have to trust the company to invest their savings, $20 a month, for the next 25 years, and know that we'll be there in 25 years to pay them what we promised them. So it is possibly easier for a company like us to behave responsibly, because of the nature of our product and the damage to our business would be immediate in the short term if we deviated from a long-term approach and if it became visible to people. And it is actually very interesting because that is absolutely in the genetic code of the company. It was a key part of the Industrial Revolution in England. There is, for those who know England, the man from the poor is a very well-known expression that has gone in the common language because it was part of the development of the middle class, the saving habits, and the notion that company would always be there to serve. And I find it really interesting that we have then been so successful in Asia, because that set of values, which served us extremely well in the UK, has been transferred, I would say, seamlessly to Asia.
And if I'm a poor person in a village in Asia, how does this work?
Well, it works because, in poor countries, life accidents are one of the first causes why people fall below the poverty line. So death, generally, if you look at the statistics, it's a huge contributor to the growth of poverty, the fact that people have no protection. So the first thing we do is protect people against life accidents, losing, the spouse, losing a parent, etc. And that is very important. It's an entry point. The other thing we do is it's a people business. If I mentioned Indonesia, we have 75,000 agents selling insurance in Indonesia. When I was there last month, I had to meet the top 10,000. We meet in a stadium because it's a people-intensive business. It's face-to-face. People buy from you because they trust you and they trust that you'll be there to execute. So if I step back and go back to the question of the future of enterprise, for me, we are lucky in many ways because, again, the nature of our business means that we are conducted to think long-term. The challenge is for businesses that don't have those characteristics. How can you encourage that type of behavior and reward it? Because I would agree with Paul. I think if you take the right time horizon, I don't feel a tension or a trade-off. A lot of those decisions only seem to involve a trade-off if you look at things on a very, very short-term horizon. Otherwise, if you're running a company, and if you take a long-term view, very often a lot of those decisions are no-brainers. You know what is the right thing to do, and you're very strongly incentivized to do it.
Sergio, Gabrielli, when we're talking about something in the DNA of a company, Petrobras was developed as an instrument of the state to help provide energy across Brazil. How do you think about this issue of the future of the enterprise? And particularly, one of the hypotheses of the last couple of years was to ensure you had a responsible corporation, maybe you needed to have a state-owned or state-involved corporation. And yet, in fact, Petrobras, which has been, in fact, that, has moved the other way, in fact, in terms of at least a partial privatization. So what was the thinking behind that as well?
Well, Robert, in the last five months, we went twice to the market to raise money. The first time in September last year, we raised $70 billion with the biggest stock issuance ever in the world. $70 billion. Yesterday, we finished raising $6 billion on debt. We access the equity market and the debt market. Personally, I met almost 400 different investors talking about the future of the company.
Yeah. So what's the future?
And it was interesting because what was clear for us is that we are really in a conflicting stakeholders environment. And our job is to keep balance in a very clear knife-edge path. Because sometimes we are going to be loved by the shareholders that has a very short-run view of the profit for the next quarter. Sometimes we are going to be loved by the shareholders that has a longer view that wants to see the value of the company moving towards a big solution. Sometimes the bondholders would say, look, you are affecting your EBITDA and then you cannot pay what you owe me. And sometimes the workers would say, we are not giving you the same wage as I would like to have as you have very big profit. And sometimes society as a whole would say, you are producing CO2, you are producing fuel, oil and natural gas, and you should be producing ethanol. Sometimes society is going to say, you have environmental spills and you have to be helping us to solve our problems. Our supply chain is going to complain that we are squeezing them and they cannot make profit and they cannot survive in the long run. Sometimes our customers would say, your product is not the best product that you have. I think the role of the CEO and the management of the company is to balance those conflicting interests. In order to do that, we have to have a long-term view. It's impossible to balance this every time in the short run. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that the corporate social responsibility is going to be sustainable if it is viewed as a philanthropic position. However, I think that the corporate social responsibility is part of this solution of the conflicting interests of the multiple stakeholders that creates the environment of a company, of an enterprise. I think the way to get through the time horizon, the balancing of the different interests, we require legitimacy. And legitimacy would come from giving profitability in the short run that is reasonable with a long-run pattern. Keeping a very good relationship with all the different stakeholders and dividing part of the created value with the society as a whole, especially in the supply chain. Especially in the supply chain. If we have a very clear procurement policy that tries to give to the supply chain conditions to develop themselves, we get legitimacy from the business sector. On the other hand, the society at large would get a better view and a better approval for our action if they see some of our actions creating jobs and opportunities for them. And I think that's the key point, to be balancing between different conflicting interests.
And let me ask a general question, because I mean that sounds pretty compelling. The idea you balance the short term and the long term, you can actually help provide nutritional food for consumers, you can be helping people actually ensure that an accident doesn't become a family tragedy, you can help build the supply chain. And yet, the criticism of the last few years has been this hasn't been happening. So it's either that it hasn't been happening more broadly, despite these great examples, or if it has been happening, it certainly hasn't been heard, because that's certainly not what's reflected in terms of how corporations are viewed right now today. So why is that? Why is there such a disconnect between these opportunities and this integrated thinking we've just been hearing and the reputation of corporations today? Michael, what's your thought on that?
Well, I'm going to, before I get to that, I'd like to actually home in on this phrase and this way that Sergio just said it, which is balancing conflicting interests. And for sure, there's conflicting interests. And for sure, pragmatically, there's balancing and there is short and long term. But I think the point that I've been trying to make, and I do in this article, is that there actually are a lot more opportunities where there is no conflicting interest.
Yeah.
But we've just somehow looked right by them. So let me just... So Walmart reduced packaging and saved $200 million of cost savings. Johnson & Johnson put in employee wellness programs, put money into employee wellness, which most companies historically have said this employee health stuff is a cost, it's a disadvantage, it reduces our profitability. J&J puts money into corporate wellness program and they save $250 million. So what this says is there's not necessarily a conflict here. There's not a balance between clean environment and running a company productively and making profit. There's not a conflict between worrying about the health of your employees and actually having a profitable and productive company because the people are there and they're not absent. So I guess what I am suggesting here is that there's a much broader opportunity to not actually have to make a trade-off or a balance. Let me give you another example, and Sergio, you mentioned this point, and I'm not trying to be provocative here, but I just want us to really push to where how we think about this. So let's take purchasing. You brought up procurement. And, there's been a lot of energy in procurement because of the idea that we have these, for example, great cases, the poor farmers in developing countries are not getting fair prices for their produce. So what do we do about that in the corporation? Well, I think we have the more traditional CSR thinking that says, okay, we have to be responsible and good citizens. So we will sign up for the fair trade movement. What's the fair trade movement? The fair trade movement is we'll have a compact to give the farmers higher prices. And we'll all agree that we'll give the farmers higher prices. We haven't created any value. We've taken the existing pie and we've redistributed it. We've said the farmers get more because that's fair. Now, there's another way of dealing with the same problem of poor farmers, and I think Nestlé has taken a very different approach. They said, look, why are farmers poor? Because they have lousy yields. Because the quality isn't good enough, and therefore the prices are very low. And there's a massive amount of environmental damage because they're not farming in a way that allows them to renew their fields and produce sustainably over time. So Nestlé, and I shouldn't speak for Paul, but some other companies as well have started to say, wait a minute, let's work with our farmers. Let's help them create more value. And then they're going to have much higher incomes, but we're also going to get better quality, better supply, more reliability in our. So that's a distinction between what I think has been the sort of CSR movement. We have to be good citizens. We have to be philanthropic. We have to have corporate foundations. We have to give money. And I think this next evolution, I hope, which is this notion that we can create shared value. It's not about redividing the pie. It's about being smarter and thinking more creatively about how to actually create value, economic value, which will allow everybody to share. Now, I'm sure Sergio doesn't disagree at some fundamental level with what I'm saying, but I think this is the fault line in corporate practice right now. How to think about this issue.
I'm going to give you my own example, the example of my company. We have 67,000 small farmers producing feedstock for our biofuels production. We have the same type of idea of Nestlé. We are giving to them better seeds, improving the extension of the use of new technology for production. We are trying to give them long-term contracts that they can have a stable income flow. we are trying to develop infrastructure and logistics to get products to us. We know that this is going to be good for us, but this takes time. It takes 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Whenever you have to reduce the dividend yield to our shareholders to do that. Then it's a conflicting interest. We have to show to them that this is going to be a good thing in the long run. Let me give you another example. In high quality industrial production, very sophisticated equipment, drilling rigs for more than 10,000 feet of deep water depth. That's a very sophisticated product, a lot of robotics, a lot of very few producers in the world. We want them to build the 28 drilling rigs that we need in Brazil. We know that the first rigs are going to be more expensive than if we did that in Korea or in Singapore. We are bringing Singaporeans and Koreans to come to Brazil to work with us. We know that in the short run we may pay more. In the long run we are going to have a more stable supply, increasing capacity in this important role, and then this will create possibility for improving our revenues. It's not philanthropy. It's increasing capacity, but there is a clear conflicting interest in the short run, in the long run.
I agree with Sergio. But I want to put another question back to you, Michael. What happened to academia? What happened to the business schools? You know, for years, we learned in business schools, you should focus on the short term, deliver the returns. The Milton Friedman approach was what was taught in business schools. Until the world collapsed around us and short-termism got us to our knees. And even then, academia was late. Until about 18 months ago, there was no oath. There was no Michael Porter's article in the Harvard Business School. What happened to the lawyers? Why didn't the lawyers come and say, there is the law of limited liability, and you get that because you owe society a duty of care? Didn't the law school speak to the business school? What happened?
Well, I think it's guilty as charged. I think we as we tried to get more sophisticated about management, we ended up kind of concocting this, again, very narrow way of thinking about management. I mean, the idea. Here's how you make money. You rationalize. You lay off people. You outsource to some low-wage location, and that's smart. And what we find over and over again is it turns out not to be smart. It's kind of a self-defeating process. You ultimately have no competitive advantage. You don't build a high-quality workforce. You don't innovate. But yet we got this very kind of very very narrow view of what maximizing profits was all about. And we lost this perspective on. I love the word contextual. I think we've seen management sort of in a bubble. We haven't understood the context and the impacts outside of that bubble. And somehow it was a closed system, and it didn't matter if the community was not doing well, and it didn't matter if there were these. It wouldn't matter if our products weren't actually benefiting the customer, but we could persuade them to buy it. So I don't know. I'm not answering your question.
No, but I suggest we do something, Robert. Yeah. We take all of the people who are financial analysts, equity analysts, who trade in stocks, send them back to school to learn about long-term sustainability and short-term performance of the company. Yeah. Because it's not people in the company. We want to do the right thing. But working within this financial system, I think we ought to send them all back to school, and we ought to get schools to retool them to think about the role of the corporation the right way. I think the time has come. I mean it.
No, just reflecting, Indra, I agree, but I think it's a joint responsibility. As I was listening to all of you, I was thinking, well, the reality is as management, often you know what is the right thing to do. And if you cannot explain that to your investors, well, that's your challenge. My experience of investors, I'm like you, have hundreds of investors. There are all kinds of investors, but it's your challenge to build a case. And if what you're saying holds water and is valid, you should be able to get for instance, we invest a lot of money in financial literacy. Well, that's an easy example because we sell financial products. Okay, so it's completely self-serving, and it's true that if we educate people, we sell more of our products. But it's never challenged by the shareholders. I think that. Often, and that's why I think you're right to address the question to business schools, management imposes on itself constraints. right? And doesn't realize that actually you have the freedom. If you go out and make your case, investors are not that stupid. Markets are pretty smart, and they can tell the difference between the companies that maximize profit. I've seen companies announce cost-cutting measures and see their share price go down. I mean, it does happen. People can start to see through that. But you're destroying your social contract with your employees, and you're actually depleting the value of the company by doing that.
Let's continue. Paul, let's get your comments, and I'd like to open up. I saw about 25 financial analysts just came in through the door, so we want to give them a moment.
But coming back, I don't see, I don't see conflicts here. Actually, I never went to school, and they never teach me, you now go into economy, you're going to be an economist or an entrepreneur or whatever, so that's hit and run. Make your buck and go. I never learned that, I must say. You're always part of society, you have some values, principles, and perception as reality. I know the discussion is here because we feel in society, business, big companies, multinationals, all that. We have a work to do to connect again with society, a little bit of saying what we actually do. You see what happened. The World Economic Forum has 40 years. What happened in the 40 years? That's basically the 40 years of globalization. You see, in general, a few things. The worldwide GDP has more than doubled. The absolute poverty level has been reduced by half. And why? What was the engine behind this? Well, it was the entrepreneur. It was the economic activity. And again, there's many bad things happened the last 2-3 years, and we speak about the financial crisis. This was not a financial crisis, it was a value crisis somewhere. We mixed up short-term, long-term. Somebody told me very, very wise words. He said, when ambition turns into greed, and when confidence turns into arrogance, then you hit the wall like here. And let's face it, 99.9% of the entrepreneurs, of the businesses, went about their business in a meaningful way, trying to connect with society at large, creating jobs, creating better products that are answering some needs in society. What we have to do, though, is make these things more explicit. And actually the whole theme of this forum, which is common norms, is a request of let's go back to certain basic principles here and basic values. And actually it should be the counterweight to what we start seeing too, that they want now to over-regulate. It's like if you would ask somebody to write down or regulate honesty, he needs quite a few books to do that, so don't try. People know what honesty is. So we have, and that's contextual thinking. We should put these things in context again. I do believe we have a role to play in making that explicit to society at large. It is true, though, that in the Western world that was more criticized. You go to the developing world, and the entrepreneur is pretty much liked because he sets up a factory where there was no work, and so you have to see a little bit where it comes from, and we see the world too much from the Western world, and you cannot please everybody, that's true. So you have conflicts, but I don't see my role as trying to combine conflicts. What I do is, or try to do is, through these different angles of view, shaping what I want to be, what the purpose, as you call it, of your company is, and then enthusiastically align our people behind it with a sense of purpose and pride, and go about what we want to do with conviction and connect it in a broader context. Because if I would only drive and define what I have to do by trying to combine all the possible conflicts and all, I think that would be stressful.
Well, let's continue this conversation. I mean, we're saying we have a sense of the balancing the short and the long term. Part of the opportunity seems to be realizing these things aren't necessarily contradictory. You can actually do both with the right amount of imagination and focus. Part of it is perhaps the education of what people are actually thinking. A lot of it's about leadership and communication. Let's see what other views are out here. And perhaps if we've got the microphone, if I could ask you to make sort of a very short question or comment, no more than 30 seconds. But I'd like to also start with Sam de Piazza, who's just here. If you could just provide the microphone. Because, Sam, you've been spending the last year as chair of the Global Agenda Council on the role of business. What are you hearing here, and what's your reaction?
Well, Robert, I would first say that these four CEOs, and there are hundreds of others like them, recognize that they operate with multiple stakeholders in an ecosystem, and that they don't have an absolute license to operate. And so what we've been trying to do is to find, okay, if we agree that we have multiple stakeholders, if we agree we have to confirm our license, why do we have conditions that don't seem to work, that don't go well? And frankly, it's a few things. We think that frankly, the corporate social responsibility movement, which in some societies work very well, but in others it doesn't. And if the corporate social responsibility officer reports to marketing, you got it wrong. And I'm not going to turn around and ask how many CEOs have it reporting to marketing. If it's not strategy, straight to the head, I won't ask you to tell me where yours report. That's the first thing. The second thing, long-term investing is not necessarily, I mean, we all agree it's right, but it's not built into the markets. Markets treat short-term equity and long-term equity the same way. You have long-term yield curves in debt. Why don't you have long-term yield curves in equity? Why don't we have policy that actually says if you own a share of stock in one day, you're treated differently than if you own it for 5 years. You have to stay a shareholder for 3 years to get a dividend. And so these are some of the things we really think. The business, a lot of CEOs want to do the right thing. But our framework is not necessarily right, and business has to begin to face it. I'm curious to get reactions from the people on the stage.
Great. Let's get a couple of more comments or questions, and then we'll come back to the panel for some reaction. Please, a gentleman right here in the middle.
Mutambara from Zimbabwe. This is an excellent discussion, and I think we can use this as a basis to define the new reality. And Michael Porter has done a very excellent article. But I think when you start fighting the issue of balancing conflicts, when you start fighting the issue of trade-offs, I think you're overstating your case. I understand when you say sometimes you can have the value without managing conflicts, you can have it without trade-offs. But remember your 5 conditions for strategy. Number 3 is trade-offs. So having trade-offs is actually part of your definition of what is strategy.
There you go. Well, you know, that's the Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe has been studying your work. So I actually think that's a good thing for the future of the country. Listen, we don't have very much time, but let me ask you, what would you take away on this in terms of what are you going to be communicating to the CEOs or others who are listening in on this? Is it just an easy thing to do because, in fact, there's a win-win solution that people hadn't recognized? Or is it tougher or different than that? And really, what is it that people should be doing differently as a result of this conversation?
Well, I don't want to get technical on the trade-offs point, but again, I would say that the point of the article, and I think that we've actually seen quite a few examples of the principles in the article discussed here, is that we must not presume that to attack or deal with an important social issue actually requires a trade-off with the economic performance of the company. We should not start with that assumption. And that's been deeply embedded in a lot of thinking. And the whole CSR movement is based on that thinking, that there's business and then there's CSR. And we make money in the business and then we take some of that and we deploy it to be good, okay? And so number one point of the article is that's not right, that there's a lot of cases where that trade-off doesn't exist, and that where we can, if we think more broadly about context, and truly if we think more long-term, then we can actually run our companies differently to have much greater impact on society at the same time as we can meet our economic goals. So that's the central idea. And
let me ask, one of the elements that came out that Sam was mentioning, this idea of an upward sloping yield curve for equity. The idea that, you know what, if a person, you know, short-term debt gets paid a different amount than debt that's prepared to commit for 5 or 10 years. Should a shareholder that's prepared to invest for 5 or 10 years actually have certain advantages, whatever they may be, that are different than a shareholder who's going to invest for a nanosecond?
It's a good idea.
I think that this is one of the sources of the conflicting interest. Mm-hmm. But I think that if I agree with my friend here, that if we have to be every day managing conflicts, we cannot do anything, and we lose our license to be CEOs. I think you have to find ways that you can get the majority of the interests aligned in some ways. My company, for example, we have 57 years of a company. Since the beginning, we have, in our strategic view, the responsibility with our community as one of our strategic pillars of our strategy. It's not linked to the marketing. And I think that's very important because otherwise you cannot face to face with a short-run guy that wants to have a dividend yield this year, and you have to provide a quarterly result that's excellent. And they have to accept that our total shareholders' return is much bigger than dividend yield.
Indra, what's your any takeaways?
Well, I tell you, I think every company is made up of employees, and employees are people who live and work in every one of the communities. When we operate a company just for the short term, we're basically telling the employee, when you come to work, leave yourself at the door, come into the company and be somebody different. Because we're going to operate this company irrespective of the impact on society. On the other hand, if you really operate the company with purpose, that you're ensuring the sustainability of the company, you're asking that person to bring their whole self to work. And an employee who brings their whole self to work is a hell of a lot better than somebody who leaves half of themselves outside. So you get them to work head, heart, and hands on the job.
Paul?
Well, pretty much in the same direction. I mean, I think also it's overall also to give your company a profile, and then investors, they know what profile they invest in, and there are alternatives. But we are definitely in our activity linked with long-term dimensions. For example, if we set up a milk factory, we connect with milk farmers, and these are long-term commitments. And you cannot shut down a cow. You don't run away. So these are, and that's intrinsically linked with our company. But we have to be explicit to the world and connect authentically with the world, and then the choices are there. And it's true that there are conflicting tensions. You have to make choices. But then when you make these choices, be explicit about them, justify them, or not justify, argument them. And it is true, when you do that, there's two dimensions to it. First of all, Nestlé, 280,000 people in the world. Having that alignment and enthusiasm for that purpose, as we call it here. And also to the outside world. So I feel also you cannot, and you please everybody, because then you start pleasing nobody. And it's not a matter of pleasing. I do feel that you have to stay true to yourself too, and to your convictions and values.
Make those decisions. Tijan.
I think human beings are fantastic. I was just reflecting, the first job I got, when I went back to Africa, I was told something I didn't know before, that nobody had been paid for 6 months, and I was told that we can't pay anybody for the next 6 months. So one thing I certainly know from experience is that actually people don't work for money, because I've run a company with 4,000 employees for 6 months without being able to pay a salary to anybody. People may need the money, they don't work for money. They work for a higher purpose. And I'm going back to what Indra was saying, and that's what a company ultimately provides. It helps people fulfill their ambitions, their self-esteem, and I think it's very important to keep that in mind. So it goes back to leadership, it goes back to what Paul was saying about articulating that for the market, for the investors, so that you differentiate yourself. But it's my experience that really companies that do that over time succeed on every measure, whether it's profit, whether it's sustainability, whether it's the quality of the people they hire, and it's really having the courage to lead in that direction and being unapologetic about it and being very explicit. I don't accept that the markets stop you from doing that. I actually think that there is a space for such companies, and I think all my colleagues here are very good illustrations of that. So we need to spread the good word and continue demonstrating that you can do well and do good at the same time, and that opposition is a fake opposition. Right?
Well, and it sounds like one of the conclusions has got to be that the only viable future of enterprise is a long-term future for enterprise. And the element of strategies actually identifying these opportunities to actually link creation for the value for the community with the value for the shareholders, and leadership as part of actually making those tough decisions to make sure that really takes place. Well, please join me in thanking this great panel.